Hi, I'm Rhett Talbot, and welcome to the Beyond Data podcast. We live in a world of big data where it is sometimes surprising to learn that we don't have, or at least don't have ready access to, the information necessary to really understand a thing, to make important decisions based on something more concrete than anecdote and alternative facts. Beyond Data is a new science podcast tackling issues that are not as data-centric as we might initially think. Issues that require us to go beyond the data. There is a brown trout on the cover of the winter 2018 issue of Trout magazine, the magazine of Trout Unlimited, or TU as it is commonly called. It's the kind of picture that likely excites an angler, a big fish with beautiful coloration, the sheen of water coming off the heft of its body as the angler cradles it close prior to a presumed release. It's a picture that exudes reverence for a pastime that inspires waist-deep wading in icy winter rivers. Reverence for water and wildness, reverence for the fish itself. For some, however, there is a certain irony in featuring a brown trout on the cover of Trout Unlimited's flagship publication. TU, after all, is a national organization with a mission to, quote, conserve, protect, and restore North America's cold water fisheries and their watersheds. The brown trout, however, is not a native fish, which may beg the question of whether or not a watershed should be considered restored if it contains healthy populations of non-native fishes, especially non-native fishes that the data show can create a burden on native fishes. Most anglers, even conservation-minded ones, with whom I spoke for this episode, say they don't see the irony. Many say they regularly fish for brown trout and practice catch and release. Some have even traveled thousands of miles to fish for brown trout in other countries where this species is also non-native. More than a few anglers told me that they were unaware the brown trout are not native to North America. For many anglers, brown trout are as much a part of the landscape as the other species they love: brook and cutthroat trout, various salmon species, and others. Many argue that healthy populations of any trout, char, or salmon, fishes collectively known as salmonids, are indicators of healthy aquatic ecosystems, whether those fishes are native to the ecosystem or not. But not everyone agrees non-native species can be part of a healthy ecosystem, aquatic or otherwise. When it comes to the issue of native versus non-native animals and their place in ecosystems, there are few black and whites. The debate, while sometimes framed as binary, is more often than not complex. There are few easy answers, and the deeper you go, the more complex it becomes. For me, at the heart of the issue is a question to which I have continually returned as I've been researching this episode. Why is it that we revere some non-native species and demonize others? Why do we give some species a pass, even embrace them as part of a healthy ecosystem, while we go to great lengths to eradicate others? Why, for example, do we put a non-native brown trout, Chinook salmon, or rainbow trout on a pedestal, but demonize lionfish, snakehead, and carp? In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the interplay between native and non-native fish species. We'll talk to scientists, fisheries managers, conservationists, authors, and anglers. We'll look for the data when they exist, but we'll also go beyond the data into the realm of philosophy and even politics to grapple with issues such as what it means to be native and how the label can shape our perceptions. Before we get too far into the weeds, however, it'll be helpful to start with a few definitions to both frame the conversation and to place it into context.
The best way to define a native species is one that has a clear evolutionary history tied to particular geographic locations.
Dr. Julie Lockwood is a professor in ecology, evolution, and natural resources at Rutgers University. She is co-author of the textbook Invasion Ecology, which is a comprehensive introduction to all aspects of biological invasion by non-native species. Establishing a clear evolutionary history tied to a specific location in order to determine that a species is native may be a good working definition for an invasion ecologist, but there is actually a far easier way, at least on the surface, to differentiate between native and non-native species.
We tend to divide up native from non-native species according to whether or not those species have realized their current distribution with the help of humans.
Most of the invasion scientists with whom I spoke define the dividing line between native and non-native species in this way. If a human was involved in relocating a species, it is a non-native species. But if a species relocated on its own, it is considered a native species. For example, the Galapagos tortoise, which made its way from mainland South America to the Galapagos Islands on its own, is a native species, while the goats and rats introduced by whalers starting in the 17th century are non-native species. Another term commonly used in both the invasion sciences and in everyday language is the term invasive. Clearly, an invasive species is a non-native species, but are all non-native species invasive species?
Typically, we only define a species as being invasive as if, first of all, it's non-native, and second of all, that it has expanded its range, its geographic range, extensively within its new habitat, new location.
Critics argue, however, that there are plenty of so-called invasive species that may be benefiting native species, even endangered native species. They argue that labeling them with the oft-assumed pejorative invasive is neither accurate nor helpful. For example, the western honeybee fits a definition of invasive insofar as the species has expanded its geographic range extensively since it first arrived with the colonists in the 17th century, but we don't commonly think of the western honeybee as an invasive. In fact, the honeybee is commonly cultivated and introduced to new areas for the benefit they provide, and it has become the leading pollinator for agriculture worldwide. So do we need a more nuanced definition of invasive?
In some cases, there's another piece to that definition, and that we would only call a species as invasive if it shows clear negative ecological or economic or even human health impacts.
This more nuanced definition, in which the non-native species must have clear ecological, economic, or human health impacts, allows for the possibility that some non-native species might actually have a positive impact on their new home.
That's one of the useful things about dividing up and thinking about only applying maybe that term invasive to those things that have a negative impact, is that you then don't shut down the possibility that non-native species have a positive impact, and they can have a positive and negative impact at the same time. That's increasingly, I'd say, common. Well, I don't know if I'd say common. It's increasingly, you can see it increasingly across the world. So especially as these non-native species have been in a particular location for a long time. So the case with the brown trout is replicated, for example, with pigs in Hawaii, or even Pacific lionfish in the Caribbean. You know, the people fish for them, the people who will eat them. So is that a positive impact on the economy? Probably so. Is it having a negative impact at the same time? Yes. So a species can have both positive and negative impacts at the same time.
New Zealand is a country where non-native species certainly have a positive impact on the economy. This is especially the case when it comes to hunting and fishing, where New Zealand is absolutely legendary, a bucket list destination.
As the centuries ease by, the South Island of New Zealand remains Earth's virgin utopia of pristine beauty and the ultimate destination for the elite sportsman.
The language used in this promotional video for New Zealand's Silver Pine Lodge is not uncommon in an important segment of the country's tourist industry. But while it surely captures the majesty of the landscape and the opportunities it provides as a sporting paradise, it also, not unlike the brown trout on the cover of Trout magazine, may insinuate an insipid irony.
Silver Pine is simply your launch pad for a host of unrivaled hunting and fishing opportunities. Two of the top trophies up for grabs are the New Zealand red stag, hunted on property, and the elusive Himalayan tahr, found via your own helicopter in the nearby high country.
The fact that both of these trophy species are non-native, brought to New Zealand by colonists intent on creating hunting opportunities, surely contradicts the description presented moments before of New Zealand as being Earth's virgin utopia. Likewise, when it comes to the angling opportunities, it is once again non-native species at the center of the sales pitch.
And for the fly fisherman, or woman, there is no other place in the world that offers better sight fishing for wild rainbow and brown trout.
Most of the threatened non-migratory galactids are in the South Island, where brown trout is the major threat.
Dr. David West is the New Zealand Department of Conservation Freshwater Science Advisor. New Zealand's native freshwater fishes are under siege, with nearly 70% considered threatened. One group of these imperiled fishes, the galaxids that Dave mentioned, are particularly in trouble, with several species at risk of extinction. One study estimated that 3 native fish populations a year are lost to predation from non-native brown trout. It's therefore not surprising that there are those in New Zealand who feel eradicating brown trout and other salmonids is the right thing to do in the best interest of embattled native fishes like galaxids. Not everyone agrees, though, especially given the reverence with which anglers and those in the tourism sector who benefit from angling view the species. There was one place, however, where in 2011 an experimental eradication program might not be seen as so controversial, where it might even be mandated.
Zealandia or Karori Sanctuary Trust were keen to get rid of trout. Zealandia is a native-only sanctuary. That's their goal anyway, in the centre of Wellington. So they've got a predator-proof fence around it. So they've been trying to get rid of pretty much most of the exotic land mammals. I think they might have got rid of most of the mice now. I think the mice are the last thing. And they wanted to do the same with the streams.
As nature intended is one of the taglines used by Zealandia Sanctuary, but perhaps it could also be Earth's Virgin Utopia. The goal is to restore the valley's forest and freshwater ecosystems as closely as possible to their pre-human state, which of course means no brown trout or other non-native salmonids. In the sanctuary, Dave and his team wanted to demonstrate effective methodology for removing non-native trout and then restoring a native species that the data showed was signaling an eventual population collapse, due largely to predation by trout.
So it's a galaxid. It's scaleless. It's quite an old family of fish. So we've got quite a few galaxids in New Zealand of wide variety. So we've got everything from a giant kokopu, which actually gets up to about 40 centimetres and very stocky, a real decent fish, through to little non-migratories that are quite similar to a smelt or whatever. So they're about, say, 60 millimetres maximum.
Native fishes like galaxids generally receive less attention than native terrestrial animals and even plants. But the data that are available show that salmonids, and I'm quoting now from a 2009 paper in the New Zealand Journal of Ecology, have caused widespread reductions in the distribution and abundance of native galaxid fishes, a family dominated by threatened species. In the case of galaxids in New Zealand, several species not in Zealandia Sanctuary are restricted to just a few kilometers of stream.
Trout may not be the primary threat to all of those streams, but certainly they're contributing to the limited range that these species can occur in the landscape, because trout are invading and filling up the rest of the space.
Dave and his colleagues believe that success in Zealandia could put a new conservation tool in the Department of Conservation's toolbox that might be essential to saving endangered species from extinction.
Yeah, and an extinction of one of our non-migratory galaxids would be something that nobody would want. Even the most radical fish and game, well, not necessarily fish and game, but most radical trout angler would hope, not want us to lose one of our species.
Dave is alluding here to opposition to trout eradication programs by not only some anglers, but also by Fish and Game New Zealand, a group of 12 regional councils that are responsible for managing the country's game fish and game birds. It's not that anglers or Fish and Game would necessarily object to a limited eradication of brown trout in Zealandia Sanctuary, although Dave tells me Fish and Game ultimately did oppose the experiment after initially supporting it. Rather, the concern is that one successful eradication could set in motion a slippery slope, leading to other eradication programs in places where fishing for salmonids has become a significant part of the economy and even the character of the region. In their report assessing the Zealandia experiment, Dave and his co-authors explicitly stated that one of the major difficulties they faced was changing the misconception that the eradication of trout would become widespread. It might be worth broadening our lens here for a moment and talking briefly about how brown trout came to be so revered in New Zealand. Revered to the point where not everyone would automatically be on board with eradicating them in areas where the data clearly show they are a dire threat to native species.
So they were introduced deliberately as a sports fish. The dogma is that when New Zealand was colonized by Europeans, they thought the streams were pretty much empty, so they thought they should be filled with things. And for better or for worse, a lot of those things were trout.
The intentional introductions of non-native species of plants and animals began in the 1860s and were carried out by so-called acclimatization societies, which were present in many areas colonized by Europeans, including North America. The motivation for introducing non-native species ranged from sport and utility to nostalgia, making the landscape more like home for wistful colonists. Two generally misguided colonial principles prevailed. First, that European flora and fauna were superior to native flora and fauna. And second, that non-native species wouldn't do any harm to ecosystems that many Europeans considered already impoverished. In the case of game fish and game birds, the acclimatization societies eventually started selling fishing and hunting licenses to offset some of their expenses. With the sale of these licenses came the inevitable rise of poaching, which in turn necessitated wardens employed by the societies. In 1990, the acclimatization societies themselves became Fish and Game New Zealand. Rather than that virgin utopia, many of the most famous sporting destinations in New Zealand came to be dominated by carefully curated, managed, and conserved non-native game species. In time, these species became so much a part of the landscape that even the suggestion of their removal could incite strong opposition, even to a very limited experimental eradication program in a native-only sanctuary.
When we did the 2011 trial, there was articles in the Fish and Game magazines about me as a sort of a fish slaughterer.
To be fair to Dave's critics, the eradication method employed in the 2011 trial in Zealandia is not for the faint-hearted. Even its supporters have called it a sinister means to a critical cause. While techniques such as netting and electrofishing are sometimes used in an effort to remove non-native species of fishes from invaded waters, these techniques frequently fail to remove 100% of the target species. Poisoning a body of water is far more effective, and the pesticide of choice is called rotenone. Rotenone occurs naturally in several plants and is especially toxic to aquatic organisms, but not to humans. It breaks down rapidly in water to levels that are undetectable, and there is little if any residual toxicity. Still, it is an extreme measure, as evidenced by the following excerpt from a 2012 article published in Fish and Game New Zealand. The full article, titled Silently Spreading Death, is linked in the show notes.
The brown trout emerged into view from where it had previously been safely hidden from the white-suited figures moving around just upstream. A mild discomfort in its mouth and gills had triggered the initial movement, but gave way now to an overwhelming sensation of suffocation-induced panic swimming around the pool looking for a way out. But there was no escape. Before it could find the exit, the trout began to lose coordination, struggling to remain upright before it made a last desperate lunge across the pool, beaching itself near the outlet. It gasped a few times, but apart from a few faint twitches along its handsome flanks, it remained motionless. It was dead. Upstream from the trout, the white-suited figures continued to pour a liquid slurry of poisonous rotenone into the picturesque forest stream, silently spreading the death downstream. In their view, they were pursuing a worthy cause, the eradication of trout from the stream to restore habitat for a native fish species. From others' perspective, they were environmental vandals of the highest order.
Those involved with the 2011 brown trout eradication trial in Zealandia call it a success. The brown trout were fully eradicated from the 2 target streams and 1 reservoir, and while reintroduced adults in the population of the native galaxid species they were attempting to restore saw a temporary decline in condition, their spawning behavior was not affected. Within a year, essential aquatic invertebrate communities that were negatively affected by the poison had recolonized the affected areas, and during extensive monitoring in 2015, scientists observed healthy numbers of juvenile native fishes, juveniles that had previously become prey to brown trout. While the Zealandia trial proved that rotenone is an effective and potentially important conservation tool for removing invasive salmonids from areas where they threaten the survival of highly endangered native fishes, there is currently no plan to use that tool to assist some of the most endangered native species in New Zealand. I asked Dave if he thought an apparent unwillingness to undertake more salmonid eradication programs would eventually lead to extinctions, especially for those populations restricted to just a few kilometers of stream.
I think we'll manage to keep them hanging on those 3 streams. There are some other New Zealand academics who, are projecting, extinctions by 2020 and stuff like that. I think that's, I think it's unlikely, but it's because we'll just slow things down rather than turn things around. What these species need is to be, more streams to be opened up, and if you gave them a chance, they would colonize quickly. I mean, that's one of the benefits of they produce a lot of fry, so if you can keep the trout out, they will respond quickly.
But I had to wonder, given the risks, given the potential to actually lose unique species, is slowing things down really enough? Why not turn them around, especially when the tools to do so are available and shown to be effective? Isn't that frustrating?
I think conservation in any developed country these days is a challenging and frustrating place to work, so I don't think we're any more unique than that. There's still plenty of work to do. I mean, we've, fish barriers to fix, and there's other stuff you can do. So,
like so many scientists with whom I've spoken while reporting stories as a journalist covering fisheries at the intersection of science and sustainability, Dave is optimistic, even in the face of some pretty depressing data.
I'd hope that if people were aware that, we've only got some of these species in 3 streams and trout are threatening 2 of those, then they would support us doing more in this area. But
furthermore, Dave thinks that some of the antagonism in the debate about how to handle non-native species is manufactured and hyped in the media. As I suggested in the intro to today's episode, the issues are rarely binary, black and white. According to Dave, that's the case in New Zealand, and as we'll hear shortly, it's the case much closer to home.
I don't think it's as antagonistic as people would try and play it out in the media. I think we could actually quite comfortably protect the species without having, I think, any impact on the trout fishery.
The first fish that I ever caught on a fly was a brown trout on the Baldwin River in Michigan, which is ironically where the first brown trout were reportedly planted in the United States in the 1800s.
Kirk Deeter is the vice president of Trout Unlimited, editor of Trout Media, and an editor-at-large for Field and Stream magazine. He's also a huge fan of the brown trout.
You can walk from my family cabin to the railroad trestle where those fish were poured from into the Baldwin. And now, having fished for 30-some years since then, and been all over the world, I realize that I've been chasing the same species that I started with. The brown trout in Michigan has now led me to brown trout in places like Tierra del Fuego and the South Island of New Zealand and Iceland and above the Arctic Circle in Russia. It's just been a fish that's my soul as far as fly fishing is concerned.
As Kirk mentioned, brown trout were intentionally introduced to North America in the 19th century, and that introduction is documented in Kim Todd's book, Tinkering with Eden, A Natural History of Exotics in America.
You had this guy, Fred Mather, who ironically was a huge critic of the introduction of the English sparrow, and he went over to Europe as a representative of the U.S. Fish Commission in the 1880s, and he arranged, even though he was a representative of the U.S. Fish Commission, he kind of saw this as a personal gift, but he arranged with this German to send over some brown trout.
Fred Mather was interested in technology, specifically the technologies of culturing fishes and transporting them long distances. His obsession, for that's what it became, eventually led to a thankful German Society of Fish Breeders offering to repay in kind the generosity of the U.S. Fish Commission, which had sent North American fishes like shad and salmon from California to Germany. In Tinkering with Eden, Kim includes an excerpt from a letter sent to the U.S. Fish Commission, which reads as follows. We should hail the day, dear sir, when we might be permitted to offer you, for the benefit of American rivers or lakes, any inhabitants of our waters unknown beyond the ocean. In 1880, Fred Mather was selected as the Fish Commission representative for angling and fish culture technology to the German Fisheries Exposition in Berlin.
He goes to this fishery exposition where all the countries are sort of showing what they have to offer, all the latest fishing techniques, and some different kinds of fish from each country. And then one day, sort of he sneaks off from the Fish Commission and he goes fishing and he catches a brown trout. And he really likes it. And so he asks his friend, the head of the German Society of Fish Breeders, to send him some brown trout. And the friend makes good on his word and sends some over.
Mather penned an article for the first issue of Forest and Stream, a precursor to Field and Stream, the publication, incidentally, for which Kirk Deeter, who we heard from a minute ago, is now an editor-at-large. In that article, Mather made it abundantly clear that despite the fact that most of the magazine's readers were interested in sport, the mission of fish culture, at least in Mather's opinion, should be food. Mather was himself an angler, though, and while Kim says that he noted upon seeing a live brown trout in an aquarium at the exposition in Berlin that it was, quote, not as pretty as the American brook trout, end quote, his experience on a stream in the Black Forest made him a brown trout enthusiast of the highest order. In February 1883, 80,000 German brown trout eggs arrived in the U.S. While very few, if any, of those first brown trout made it into the wild, Mather received a second shipment a year later, which he distributed to several U.S. hatcheries.
And he gave some to a fish hatchery in Northville, Michigan. And some people, some of the hatcheries kind of messed around with them and tested them and saw what they could do. But in Northville in 1884, the manager released them.
The brown trout is a salmonid, and like all salmonids, it requires relatively specific water conditions. Having said that, insofar as salmonids go, brown trout are more tolerant of both warmer and poorer water quality than many other trout species, like the native brook trout. Given its adaptability, not to mention its capacity to take advantage of prey species unfamiliar with this voracious piscivore, once the proverbial cat was out of the bag, there was no turning back.
The spread happened really rapidly. So 1884, you have the first sort of release into the wild, and then by 1900, they're in 38 states.
Because they're salmonids, they're cold water dependent. But they are, among the salmonids, fairly tolerant in terms of thermal stress.
Nathan Hitt, who goes by Than, is a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey and the lead author on a 2016 paper published in the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences titled Brook Trout Use of Thermal Refugia and Foraging Habitat Influenced by Brown Trout. The upshot of the study shows that non-native brown trout can place a burden on native brook trout under the increased water temperatures climate change can cause. If we think back to Julie's more nuanced definition of an invasive species, a non-native that is having a negative impact, it seems reasonable to call brown trout an invasive in light of Than's findings. But Than and his colleagues didn't begin their research looking at invasiveness.
We really started this investigation based on a climate perspective, and then secondarily came to the invasive species question.
The dynamic between brown trout and brook trout had been previously studied, especially by a researcher named Kurt Fausch and his colleagues.
They snorkeled streams and they observed microhabitat use, so basically where fish were holding in the water column, and took notes on brook trout and brown trout when they're co-occurring in a stream reach. And then went in and electrofished all the brown trout out and then re-snorkeled it and found that brook trout had shifted their position. And really what it gets into is optimal flow refugia. So they're basically trying to find places where they can hold in the stream without burning a lot of calories and forage efficiently.
Fausch's work was experimental evidence for an interaction between brook and brown trout. It showed that the presence of non-native brown trout in an aquatic ecosystem containing native brook trout caused the brook trout to behave differently. This finding suggested that the effect of brown trout on brook trout went beyond just simple predation, which, as you'll recall, was primarily what Dave and his colleagues were worried about in New Zealand when it came to brown trout galaxid interactions. In their study, Than and his colleagues took this research to the next level by putting it into the context of climate.
The main finding was that brook trout's ability to deal with temperature stress is the function of brown trout. So there's an interaction. Climate change and quote-unquote invasion biology, those things are going to interact as we move forward.
Other cases of climate change affecting non-native species are well documented, especially when it comes to plants. The data show, for example, that the growing season is getting longer in the continental United States, and that non-native plants are adapting to the longer growing season faster than native species. This gives the non-natives a competitive advantage that is, in some cases, threatening the native species. Previous studies had already shown that non-native brown trout can place a burden on native brook trout through predation and competition, but now Than and his colleagues were showing that the brown trout limited the ability of brook trout to utilize warmer stream temperatures.
The particularities of the specifics of what we observed for this brown trout brook trout interaction was noteworthy because it showed that if brown trout are present, they can temporarily get out of the thermal refuge, this cold groundwater upwelling area, and they can forage in warmer waters periodically. They're moving out of that cold refuge into warmer waters, finding food, and returning to the refuge. In the presence of brown trout, only the browns would do that. The brook trout really couldn't compete with the browns at that higher temperature. So, as you remove the browns from that system, then you'd see some of these brook trout able to sort of occupy that niche space that brown trout were using. So they were able to move out of the thermal refuge into the warmer water, at least periodically, and then return to that refuge. So it's as though when you remove the brown trout from the system, you see brook trout being able to expand their use of thermal habitat. And we think that's going to be more important as we look ahead.
If it's true that removing brown trout from waters where brook trout are present generally expands the brook trout's reach into warmer waters, and if it's also true that this dynamic is going to be more significant in the future, then what is the argument against eradicating non-native brown trout, clearly an invasive species, from any waters where native brook trout exist?
In the fall, when they have their spawning colors, they get a sort of a squash yellow or almost pumpkin colored belly, and they have that dark sort of camouflage back so nothing can see them from above, and really just one of the most stunning fish, certainly in North America, but possibly the world as well.
Michael Steinberg is the author of the forthcoming book, A Brook Trout Pilgrimage, and as you can hear, he's as enthusiastic about brook trout as Kirk is about browns. Mike's book is part travelogue and part environmental history, and his research sent him seeking brook trout and its conservation status throughout the species' native range from Labrador to Georgia.
Brook trout sort of span the entire length of the Appalachian Mountains. Certainly brook trout in the northern end of that range are doing a lot better than in the southern end of the range for the most part. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't threats. There certainly are, but just given the climate, for instance, and given the lack of human population and alteration of watersheds in many areas, places like Maine have far more intact watersheds and brook trout populations than, let's say, northern Georgia.
Here in Maine, where the Beyond Data podcast is produced, brook trout have a special status, and yes, the species is generally doing better here than anywhere else in its native range in the U.S. According to the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Maine supports the most extensive distribution and abundance of wild brook trout in their native range within the United States. Clearly, this is a species worth protecting on numerous levels from a multitude of threats, and, officially speaking, much of that responsibility lands squarely on the shoulders of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife.
Certainly the mission and the focus, particularly of the Fisheries Division within the department, is really to conserve and enhance those fish that are present in the state of Maine, with a particular focus and emphasis really on native fish.
Francis Brodegam is the Director of Fisheries and Hatcheries at IFW. I asked him about the threats faced by native brook trout and other native cold water species in Maine. Beginning in the 18th century, Francis says, it was logging that posed the largest threat to brook trout.
Because it was those waterways that were actually used to float logs. So as a result, historically, there was not only a loss of a lot of riparian habitat that was important for brook trout, but a lot of the streams were manipulated with various log driving dams. They were channelized, all to facilitate the transport of logs that were harvested in interior parts of Maine.
While habitat issues still pose a major threat to brook trout in Maine, Francis says that the biggest threat to managing and sustaining the state's brook trout population today is non-native and native transplant fishes.
Probably one of the biggest threats that we have to a lot of our native cold water fish, species like brook trout, without unquestionably be the introduction of new species of fish that either were not historically present in Maine or may be resident in the state of Maine but have been moved around. Brook trout really have evolved in the absence of many competing species. And they've certainly evolved in the absence of many of the warm water species that have been introduced to the state of Maine, things like largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, northern pike. So our brook trout really don't coexist well with those other species of fish. And it probably represents our most significant threat to managing and sustaining our brook trout populations.
If these non-native species pose the biggest threat to native fishes like brook trout, and if the conservation of brook trout and other native cold water species is, as Francis has already stated, a priority for IFW, then one might reasonably ask why IFW imposes daily bag limits on a non-native species like large and smallmouth bass. The answer to that question is complicated, and it gets back to the way Julie was defining an invasive species based on both the benefit and the harm that species may be doing. It also gets back to why many conservation-minded anglers may not see an inherent contradiction with having a brown trout on the cover of Trout Unlimited's flagship publication. IFW recently conducted a statewide angler survey to get a better sense of angler use and angler preferences, and the results of that survey were somewhat surprising to Francis.
And what came out of that study was, one, being that in the past, while brook trout was always our number one most preferred fish in the state, and it's still the number one most preferred fish in the state, bass, which are non-native to the state, and have always had a presence and have always had a growing interest in the state, are now the number two most preferred fish by Maine anglers. So our number two most preferred fish is now a non-native fish.
As IFW states on its website, the agency's constituents include the fish and wildlife and people who call Maine home, as well as the visiting outdoor enthusiasts and ecotourists who call Maine vacation land and contribute hundreds of millions of dollars each year to the state's economy. In other words, while preserving and protecting Maine's fishes is central to IFW's mission, so too is serving anglers by enhancing fisheries for the purpose of creating a good angling experience that ultimately benefits the state's economy. Francis acknowledges that it's a tough balancing act when the data show the public desires a specific type of fishing experience that his agency is then expected to provide.
It's going to create some challenges in terms of figuring out how and where we manage for bass and how and where we don't. Because obviously bass in some parts of the state where maybe fisheries have already been compromised can probably maintain an important fishery and use opportunity for the angler public. But in other parts of the state, particularly in the northern parts of the state where we have more of our wild coldwater salmonid populations, we certainly don't want to see bass expanded into that part of the state. In fact, we recently adopted a rule for the entire northern part of the state that established a no size or bag limit on bass in the northern part of the state as a conservation effort, really, to discourage people from stocking illegally bass into the northern parts of the state where, again, we have our native populations of coldwater fish.
For a few people with whom I spoke, an even bigger issue than the state managing for an established population of non-native fish is the intentional stalking of a non-native species like the brown trout. In 2017, IFW reports putting nearly 22,000 hatchery-raised non-native brown trout into state waters. And according to an IFW spokesperson, that number was down from previous years as one of the state's 8 fish hatcheries was offline for repairs. I broached this topic with Michael Steinberg.
Why does this continue, or why did it happen in the past? And one of the answers is that people, the general public, want to catch lots of fish. And when you buy a fishing license and you take your son or daughter fishing, you want them to have a good time, and you want them to be able to catch fish. And hatchery fish are the easiest fish to catch.
Balancing an agency's obligation to both wildlife and people is no doubt a challenge, and it's one we commonly see at both the state and the federal level. Consider, for example, the challenge faced by the National Park Service, an agency charged with preserving unimpaired some of the most iconic landscapes for future generations, while at the same time providing access to all Americans. Would Yellowstone National Park be a more pristine environment for future generations, a more virgin utopia, if there were not roads and concessions and paved paths? Yes, but the Park Service has an obligation to provide access to the 275 million visitors who visit national parks each year, and so the balancing act. I asked Francis about Maine's stocking of non-native hatchery-raised brown trout.
It's a great question, and I do recognize that I think some members of the public are really confused by the fact that our state agency does propagate stock some species of fish, including rainbows and brown trout that are non-native to the state. And so let me offer you this insight. First off, the department has adopted policies that really favor use and management for native fish. I mean, that is our focus. That is our priority as a state agency, the conservation and management of native fish. Where you run into some challenges, and the reason that non-native species of fish fill an important role in this state as well as other states, is that unfortunately, as the landscape changes, and by that I mean as waters either change in terms of the water quality or habitat, or most importantly, because as a result of an illegal introduction of an invasive species, a lot of our native species cannot be effectively managed. And as a result, as an agency, we start looking at other opportunities to still provide high-quality cold water fisheries where our native fish can no longer provide those kind of opportunities. And that's really where fish like rainbow trout and brown trout kind of fill an important role. We tend to use both those species in waters that have been compromised, again, they're not able to, in general, support native cold water fisheries. And that's the role they really fulfill in the state. And it is an important one, especially with all the changes that we're seeing in more developed parts of the state, particularly the southern coastal region, where we have most of the public, where we have a greater percentage of the new introductions and infestations, where there are more impacts to lake water quality and habitat. So those waters tend to be where you'll see more utilization of non-native fish.
As landscapes inevitably change, so too does the assemblage of animals inhabiting those altered ecosystems. Regardless of why the change occurs, certain animals will no longer be as well suited to their native home. In response, some will adapt, some will migrate, and some, of course, will perish, while other animals that are not native to that landscape, but which are now better suited to it perhaps, may move in. Critics of the invasion sciences question the field's underlying premise. Critics of scientists like Julie, scientists who are comfortable labeling non-native species that do harm to native species as quote-unquote invaders, these critics prefer to look at non-native animals as something more akin to immigrants. They argue that the fact a species was introduced by humans should not be a defining characteristic. Instead, these quote-unquote invaders should be seen as opportunistic, as species simply taking advantage of new vectors for migration, even if those vectors were created by humans, things like ballast water, the pet trade, or even intentional stalking by anglers. Remember how much Kirk loves brown trout? While Kirk is clear that he would never advocate stalking a non-native fish over a native fish, he, like many of the anglers with whom I spoke, does not use pejorative language when talking about non-native trout species, brown trout and rainbow trout, for example. He prefers to think of brown trout in a far more charitable manner.
I don't look at them like they're invasive species. I look at them like they're immigrant fish. And they were invited here, they were brought here, and now they're prized. And in certain places, I wouldn't trade them for anything.
Kirk clearly sees a place for non-native brown trout, but he's not anywhere close to denying the relevance of invasion biology. And he, like many anglers, also considers himself a champion of native species, even in places to the exclusion of non-natives like brown trout. If you, however, dive a little deeper into the anti-invasion sciences rabbit hole, you will find far darker rhetoric.
I found ritual parallels between the ritual burning of non-native weeds and the ritual elements found in lynchings of African Americans. And invasion biology is actually currently being used by racist groups today. German historians have actually traced the origin of invasion biology to the Third Reich. This is Adolf.
David Theodoropoulos is the author of the book Invasion Biology, Critique of a Pseudoscience. I reached out to David for an interview, but he did not respond to numerous requests. The excerpts presented here are from a March 2011 talk he gave at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, Oregon. You can watch his whole presentation by clicking the link in the show notes. In his book, David argues that so-called invasive species are not responsible for the ecological harm heaped upon them by invasion biologists.
Harm is another concept that is redefined at will in invasion biology. That's how you can tell invasion biology is a pseudoscience. No matter what the species, no matter what the effects, they are called harmful.
David posits that the invasion sciences are little more than pseudoscientific ideology.
Okay, to be a science, a field must be objective, verifiable, repeatable, and predictive. Objective definition of terms is essential in science, and invasion biology stands or falls on the definition of the concept of native. Now, no biologist can identify what species is native to an area without prior knowledge. There are no measurable criteria, no observable characteristics that can distinguish native from non-native. Native and non-native are illusions.
According to David, an objective assessment of so-called non-native species worldwide generally reveals that invasions actually benefit ecosystems.
In all cases throughout the world, including the oceanic islands, invasion has increased biological diversity at all levels. Invasion is also entirely natural.
So, as David claims, if invasions, be it the brown tree snake in Guam, lionfish in the western Atlantic, or the western honeybee in North America, if invasions are natural, increase biodiversity, and don't do harm, then why do we so readily demonize the so-called invaders? As David readily implies, this question dovetails into some of the most divisive political issues with which we currently grapple as a nation.
An African American once said, "If I stand, I am loitering. If I walk, I am prowling. If I run, I am fleeing." Same mentality in invasion biology.
When I spoke with Kim Todd, she's the author of Tinkering with Eden, she found David's arguments to be interesting within the context of her own research.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's interesting because you see a lot of that also in the 19th century, these sort of ways that species are standing in for immigrants. And, there's all of these debates, like the language even around, like, is the starling a good citizen? And, does it have traits of these immigrants who are crowding into the cities who we don't like? Sparrows particularly, where, people viewed them as like trashy. And then people who liked them were lauding them as, these great like Anglo-Saxon birds carrying the European heritage to the U.S. So it was definitely racialized then. I'm surprised to be racialized now.
You'll recall, of course, that Fred Mather, the fellow responsible for introducing the brown trout to North America, was very critical of the introduction of the sparrow to the United States. And so we see once again that these issues are complex and can be viewed through many different lenses. One notion I've been unwilling to accept throughout all my reporting on non-native species over the years is the idea that there is no such thing as a non-native species because invasions are natural. If we accept that humans are part of nature, and therefore the vectors we create for the spread of species are also natural, then we must conclude that the lionfish is no less native to Florida than the Galapagos tortoise is to the Galapagos. And here's the clincher for me. If we accept that it's all just natural and there is no utility in fields like the invasion sciences, if we should not take corrective actions when it comes to issues like invasive species and climate change, which the data clearly link to us, then what is the justification for doing anything but throwing up our hands in the face of something like the extinction of the Atlantic salmon? In many ways, it may come down to semantics, and that's a discussion worth having, but I for one am glad the Atlantic salmon population on the Penobscot River is showing promising signs of recovery. And I think it's interesting that anglers may have played a role in that. As we bring today's episode to a close, I want to return to that brown trout on the cover of the Trout Unlimited publication. Is it an invasive species, and does that even matter? Using the established and commonly agreed upon language of invasion biology, the brown trout is a non-native species in the United States. As Than explained, it's also a species that is, according to the best available science, placing a burden on imperiled native brook trout. Recalling Julie's nuanced definition of an invasive species, it sure seems like the brown trout fits the bill. I decided to get back in touch with Francis at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I realized I had not asked him point blank if the state considers the brown trout an invasive species. I left him a message, and he called me back on a snowy morning.
This is Rhett.
Hey, Red, it's Francis Brodick. I'm calling.
Hey, Francis, how are you today?
Hey, alrighty, thanks.
Getting ready for a little snow tomorrow?
Yeah, that's what it's looking like.
Yeah, it is. We're supposed
Before
to be
following up with Francis, I'd done a little homework on the IFW website, where I found the following definition of an aquatic invasive species. Quote, an aquatic invasive species is any type of fish, plant, or any other organism that is established in a body of water where that species did not previously exist. By that definition, clearly the brown trout is an invasive species in Maine, right? But then elsewhere on the IFW website, I saw that an invasive fish is defined as, quote, a species of fish that has been illegally placed in Maine waters, end quote. Given that brown trout were introduced to state waters before there were laws against introducing non-native species, the later definition suggests that brown trout are not invasive. I was confused. And who better to clear up the confusion than IFW's Director of Fisheries and Hatcheries?
Would brown trout be considered an invasive species or not an invasive species in Maine?
Well, yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, it's a non-native species, and that's how we generally categorize both brown trout and rainbow trout. If they are stocked with rigorous review regarding consequences, then we would view that as not an illegal or an invasive introduction. But certainly rainbows and browns are not native to the state. Now, keeping in mind the definition of invasive includes that organism causes significant harm to that new environment. So I would argue that well-planned and reviewed introductions by the department will not cause a significant harm to the environment.
The interesting thing to me is that many conservation-oriented anglers believe the benefits of brown trout in North America go far beyond a popular game fish that's doing no harm when carefully managed.
Let's be honest about this. If there weren't brown trout in North America, there wouldn't be fly fishing as an industry or as a sport as we know it today.
During the course of many interviews with anglers, fisheries managers, and conservationists, I heard numerous versions of an argument that may be summed up as follows. When people are connected to a natural resource, that resource often benefits. I spoke to author Catherine Schmidt about this in regard to another embattled native cold water fish, about which she has written extensively, the Atlantic salmon. I asked her what role anglers have played in the conservation of that species.
I'm glad you asked that because I think we haven't talked about the role of the recreational angling community in protecting and restoring Atlantic salmon. So certainly they've made a difference, and during the period when pollution was the greatest, they were really the only ones who were still paying attention to the river. Fishing had left the Penobscot and actually moved to the down east rivers that weren't so polluted. But anglers were the ones who made sure that those federal agencies were doing their jobs. And anglers were the ones who made sure that there is no Basin Mills Dam in Orono right now, who made sure that the Bangor Dam did not get rebuilt. And so their voices were critically important. And that's part of the book, The President's Salmon, to show the role of anglers.
Without non-native hatchery-raised fishes in so-called put-and-take fisheries with easy access to the general public, would the sport of fishing be as large as it is? Would there be groups like Trout Unlimited with membership numbers in the hundreds of thousands? Without anglers who care deeply about trout, even if they learn to fish, as Kirk did, by catching non-native brown trout, without those anglers, would there be the Western Native Trout Initiative, the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, or the Native Fish Coalition? All groups that are working hard on behalf of imperiled natives like the brook trout, the Atlantic salmon, the Arctic char, and numerous subspecies of cutthroat trout like the West Slope cutthroat.
I'm a believer in little kids going out and catching stocked rainbows in places like Pennsylvania and New York and getting that fire lit and getting interested in fishing and the outdoors and so forth. And then we'll sort out the native fish and native places issues as we can down the road. But I think the most important thing is to have as large a group of advocates for fishing and outdoors and resources and rivers as humanly possible. And if we do that, then we can tackle the other issues down the road with greater effect than if we're just all alone, isolated, standing and shouting on top of a rock.
Of course, there is a risk-benefit analysis that needs to be undertaken here. There are probably less than 500,000 anglers who belong to organizations like Trout Unlimited and the Native Fish Coalition, but the American Sport Fishing Association estimates that there are somewhere in the order of 60 million anglers in the U.S. Put another way, can less than 1% of anglers do enough good to outweigh the potential harm done by the vast majority of anglers who may never have considered the conservation aspects of fishing? That's a discussion for another time and place, but just like Catherine's example of anglers being central to Atlantic salmon restoration on the Penobscot, there are many examples where it is anglers who are giving voice to the most pressing issues faced by aquatic ecosystems and the animals that inhabit those ecosystems. But is making catchable trout available to the general public enough? Is it enough in and of itself to ignite and then kindle a lifelong conservation ethic, a reverence for wild places and the things that inhabit them?
There must be a prompt for the occasional angler, if you will, to understand what their place is in sort of this life cycle.
Derek Young is a professional fly fishing guide on the Yakima River in Washington State.
We talk about the evolution of the angler, and from there's a river, let's go fishing. And they use whatever gear they're familiar with, whether it be a spinning rod or a hook and a worm and a bobber or a fly rod or whatever methodology they use or they choose to use. And that's their first attempt, is they go and they assume that there's fish there. Let's go fishing. Let's go catch some fish. Then it becomes, let's catch the most fish. And then it becomes, let's catch the biggest fish. And then it becomes, well, I'm glad to just catch one. And then it becomes, well, I'm glad to just be able to get out here. And that evolution also has, you have to interject a little bit of conservation into that evolution early in the game so that people just don't assume that you go to the river and you get fish. And if you're not getting fish, it's because of, there must be something that you're doing wrong, or you need to change your approach to be more effective at it, which I think can drive a negative behavior. But to that injection of that conservation ethic is to ask those questions. Well, what are the reasons why I didn't catch fish this time? Or what are the reasons why there aren't as many fish in this river? And start asking those questions. As a guy, that's always been my sort of underlying philosophy, is that on a trip with me, you're going to catch some fish, but you're also going to understand why you're catching fish and the reasons why we don't lift fish out of the water anymore, and we don't overexert them when the water temperatures are warmer, and we have these things called seasons and rules and regulations. So yes, I believe everybody has that in them, but they need that sort of injection of conservation early in the stage. Otherwise, it's just a consumptive sort of cycle, and that consumptive cycle I don't think is working. I mean, you look at fisheries across the world, that consumptive cycle just it's not working.
Derek is as much an evangelist for the West Slope cutthroat trout as Mike is for the brook trout and Kirk is for the brown trout. The population of native West Slope cutthroat in the Yakima River drainage has an uncertain conservation status, which, in large part, is why Derek and several other guides founded the Yakima River Headwater Trout Unlimited chapter in 2015. Like Mike, Kirk, and Derek told me, when it comes to native and non-native fishes, it's complicated. And there is likely a place for both the hatchery-reared non-native in the easily accessible put-and-take fishery and the wild native fish in a fairly inaccessible headwater high in the mountains. After all, the evolution of the angler may well depend on it. Still, Derek is drawn to that native fish.
I'm not so naive to think that we're at this point where we're going to be able to sort of win this fight that everything has to stay native. Our human populations are growing way too fast. The industry itself, the fishing industry, relies on the ability for people to go out and actually fish. But I do believe that there is a time and there is a place for fisheries that are intended for people to get food from, and fisheries that are intended for people to respect and to conserve and to not necessarily see as a source of a physical food, but as a source of sort of mental food, if you will.
In addition to my guest today, special thanks to Lauren McClanahan of Colby College and Molly Payne Wynn from the Nature Conservancy. Music by Andy Cohen and Fabrica Music at Hook Sounds. Sound effects by Acclivity at freesound.org. A big shout out to Jess from the Murder Road Trip podcast for New Zealand voice talent. Cheers to Clay Groves at the Fish Nerds podcast for doing all you do. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment about today's show, call into the Beyond Data voicemail line at 207-370-1575 and leave a message. We'll do our best to respond in the next Follow Up Friday episode, and you'll also be entered for a chance to win an Angler's Pint of your choice. Learn more at facebook.com/Beyond Data Podcast. Beyond Data is reported, narrated, and produced by me, Rhett Talbot, in Rockland, Maine. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please tell a friend about it, and consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, where you can also help out the show by rating it and giving us a review. That really does make a difference. Thanks.